If you've been following video game news recently, you may have noticed the emergence of a certain trend. Or a meme at this point.
I just couldn't shake the feeling that this was Persona without the heart. Without the unforgettable companion characters, the potent personal story, the incredible soundtrack, and the jaw-dropping twists and turns.
Now, I'm not here to bash a most likely underpaid writer for a huge gaming news website. I'm sure there's some truth to the person's opinion. However, I think we can all agree that it was probably not the best idea to express this truth in such polarizing words. But why were such polarizing words used, and why compare them in the first place? And why do we compare other games such as Final Fantasy XIV and WoW? I hope to answer all of this from both my perspective and from the lens of group psychology. So what is the difference between SMT and Persona to me? As a brief overview, at its most basic level, the SMT series originated from a series of science fantasy novels known as Digital Devil Story. The first novel of this series was called Megami Tensei, or Reincarnation of the Goddess. Atlus developed the first game of the series, Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei, for the Famicom and PC. Actually, fun fact, the PC version of the game came out first between July and September 1987, whereas the Famicom version came out September 11, 1987. It was based on the first and third books of the Digital Devil Story series, Megami Tensei and Tensei no Shuen, which translates to Demise of the Reincarnation. It was published by Namco and ended up being a fairly popular Japanese title. They went on to have sequels and spin-offs, and one of those spin-offs was Persona. Persona had the prefix of Shin Megami Tensei up until Persona 4 Arena and Persona 4 Golden. The combat between SMT and Persona are very similar and often influence each other. SMT obviously originated a lot of the turn-based combat, and Persona tends to err on the side of being a lot more beginner-friendly, albeit still challenging to the new player, excluding Golden and Royal editions. However, some quality of life changes tend to migrate from Persona to SMT, which makes sense. If you figure out a way to add a positive experience for your players in one game, it doesn't make sense to not bring it to your other titles. And as a personal aside of bias, as much as I like Persona, I actually do prefer the combat of SMT. Where I think the actual difference lies is in the rest of the game. Yes, SMT tends to be more gritty, dark, edgy, but that's actually not the first thing I think of when I consider the differences between the two games. What I think about is, okay, not exactly, but it's the difference of the stories being told. Where Persona is set in a not apocalyptic Japan, SMT is full-on apocalypse. So you could argue that, yes, there is more time for all of this extra stuff when you don't have to worry about being jumped by a demon in the middle of your class. But it's more so that SMT and Persona seek to tell two different stories and ask different questions. I first want to consider the Arcana system. There are specific character tropes that come through pretty heavily in Persona, and oftentimes those tropes are defined by their arcanas. However, at a closer look, the characters are nuanced and not the same person. Yukari, Rise, and An are not the same people, but share a similar role in the Lover's Arcana. Similarly, I very much doubt you would consider Maya and Mishima to be the same persona, even though they struggle with some of the same themes. From the first Persona game up until the most recent, regardless of the presence of social links, the goal of the game's themes is to understand the individual inside of the stereotype. We're encouraged to take a step closer to see the nuance of a person's situation, and how to navigate a world as an individual who's seen from a shallow perspective. SMT, on the other hand, tends to see these character tropes and takes one step backwards. The side characters represent groups of people or ideals. In its base form, the law, neutral, and chaos routes. Some games have more routes, some of these games name their routes differently, but these are the most prevalent and kind of simple way to explain it. Where Persona has these as good, bad, and true endings, they aren't fleshed out past making a bad choice and having the game end early. When Persona does this, it's almost like a check. Did you learn what the game was trying to teach you through the social links? In a way, it's similar to SMT. However, SMT wants you to choose based on a collective viewpoint. And while the characters are rather shallow and do not tend to have a personal relationship with the protagonist, it is purposeful. Even the protagonist is more of a blank slate. If the apocalypse happened and you were able to reshape the world, how would you do so? What viewpoints would you listen to? The personal nuances of an individual isn't the focus of the story, and there isn't supposed to be a clear-cut answer, although yes, sometimes there are canonical endings. The game always has pros and cons for each choice. So when someone says SMT is Persona without the heart, they aren't technically wrong. It does lack the personal connection, but the phrasing isn't nuanced enough. SMT never tried to have the same goals as Persona, which is why it's a spin-off that exists in the first place. Persona tells stories that SMT cannot, and SMT tells stories that Persona can't. Persona chooses to try and maintain the world as it is now, maybe making it better by understanding each other more. SMT doesn't have that luxury. It asks the big picture questions that are so clear because it is an apocalyptic world where you don't have the same kind of personal ties. Essentially, Persona is about the individual where SMT is about society as a whole, or psychology versus sociology. Now, obviously this is far from the only time that game journalists or YouTubers or the collective online gaming community has compared two titles and pitted them against each other. The most recent example that comes to mind for me this year was Final Fantasy XIV versus WoW. Now, what Blizzard and Activision allowed to happen in their company is not forgivable, and it does make me happy that a large group of gamers said, no, this is the last straw. But this isn't what I want to focus on. Prior to this scandal hitting headlines, Blizzard has been dropping the ball in content quality. But if you look at WoW Twitch chats, it wasn't uncommon to see a lot of toxicity against 14 for its aesthetic and its storytelling structure, and slower combat in the first 100+ hours of the game. Similarly, it wasn't uncommon to see the Final Fantasy XIV community complain about the toxicity of the WoW community. So when the scandal happened and many prominent WoW streamers jumped to Final Fantasy XIV, the narrative shifted. There are still those complaints, but many WoW players actually give 14 a chance outside of these complaints. And quite a few of these people who gave 14 a chance actually ended up sticking in the community. But even as 14 was praised by players, it was often in juxtaposition to WoW and its failures. It wasn't just, oh, 14 is good. There was also a lot of, look at how much better it is than WoW. That's not necessarily a negative thing to do, but it is a thing that happened. But why did it happen? One obvious answer is algorithm. Blizzard, WoW, Activision, those topics and keywords were heavily trending. YouTube and other social media platforms pushed content that pertained to those keywords because people were interested in the scandal. And because people were interested in the scandal, people would click on the videos that suggested this content, letting the YouTube algorithm know that yes, this is what the audience was interested in. And in a way, this is a good thing. If WoW streamers were trying 14, then some fans were willing to give it a chance outside of the common narrative. And if 14 was being pushed alongside the WoW algorithm, it allowed the information to be dispersed to a wider audience. Even though SMT came out before Persona, we can't pretend like Persona 5 didn't sell as well as it did. It gained a large following and helped to revitalize the turn-based JRPG genre in the general public perception. Yes, there were SMT fans and Persona fans well before Persona 5, but it would be disingenuous to not recognize that turn-based RPGs have declined in popularity as technology improved. Many saw turn-based as a gameplay genre that existed because of technical hardware limitations. Persona 5 came at the right time, with the right aesthetic, with fan service and quality of life improvements, and said, hey, turn-based games are their own genre, and not just because of hardware limitations. Many of us knew this before, but turn-based enthusiasts were far removed from the mainstream opinion. Turn-based is still not mainstream, but it did encourage a lot of younger gamers to try out the genre. Even though Persona stemmed from SMT, Persona is worth more to the algorithm and search engine optimization. And when keywords directly correlate to revenue, then yes, a business will push for this optimization. Going back to the Final Fantasy XIV and WoW comparison, they're both MMORPGs. Yoshi B has even stated that 2.0 was heavily influenced by WoW because it had a large impact on the genre as a whole. So, if you're trying to get someone to understand a game they aren't familiar with, it's easier to compare it to something they are familiar with. We're very verbal creatures, and we perceive the world by defining what we see by language. It's been argued that conscious thought began with the neurodevelopment of speech capabilities. One prevalent theory that you may see floating around is that the color blue didn't exist in ancient civilization. In the Odyssey, the ocean is described as being wine dark, but never mentions any variation of the color blue. In ancient Icelandic, ancient Hindu, ancient Chinese, ancient Arabic, and ancient Hebrew texts, there doesn't seem to be any word that relates to the color blue. Now, that doesn't mean the color just didn't exist, period. It's more likely that the color didn't appear as much in nature outside of the sky, and so people lumped the color in with another close color, such as the wine dark ocean. Now, where it becomes really interesting is a study published by Jules de Davidoff in 2006. Davidoff and the other members of the study worked with the Himba tribe in Namibia. They don't have a word for blue in their language, and instead they group blue in with greens. When he showed a screen with 12 squares, 11 green and 1 blue, members of the tribe struggled to identify which square was different. Even when they took a good guess, there was a lot of errors. In contrast, the baseline control group of English speakers were able to point out the color easily. And unless you're colorblind, you mostly can as well. Interestingly though, this tribe's language has far more words for the color green than the English language. And so they also showed a different group of 12 squares to the English-speaking group and the Himba tribe. All 12 were green, but one was a different shade of green. The English-speaking group failed to pick out the square, but the Himba group was able to quickly identify the correct one. This study posits that language has a greater influence on how we view the world. It's not that there isn't a difference between these squares, it's that we don't perceive it because we don't notice it. It isn't something we're consciously aware of. And so when we compare Final Fantasy XIV with WoW, or SMT with Persona, we're using language to convey a baseline, one that hopefully is more approachable to a general audience. So I don't think reviewers are necessarily wrong when comparing SMT to Persona by saying SMT does not have social links, or they share some of the same demon designs. In my opinion, where the fault lies is judging the game for not having these aspects. You may prefer having your social links and waifus and romanticizing working minimum wage jobs, but that isn't a fair critique of the game because that isn't the game's goal. It's a different game. The question should be, did the game succeed at conveying its themes and its world building? Did it deliver on the experience it promised? As a person who enjoys character-driven narratives, I do see why a one-note character may come off as bad writing, but the writing choice is deliberate. So instead of asking why you don't have a closer relationship with the character, the judgment should be, was that deliberate writing choice successful? Now, obviously Persona and SMT have their own fandoms, which are interesting, and I've met many nice people in both communities. People who have been playing SMT forever, and people who had just started their experience with Persona 5. But of course, there is turmoil between the two groups. SMT fans are very protective of their series, which does make sense. When you've been a fan since forever, you have a personal connection to it. And it does hurt when something you've loved that other people wouldn't give a chance is now being looked down on, even though Persona owes its whole formula and existence to SMT. And Persona fans get frustrated that they're looked down on for not playing a real SMT game, even though they've spent hundreds of hours on a title that they've made a real connection with. Some fans are intimidated by SMT, others don't have a means of playing an SMT title outside of emulation, and a lot of it's also age gap. There's not really a right or a wrong in this situation. You're allowed to like what you like, you're allowed to be critical of what you like, and you're allowed to like what you're critical of. The reason it's a much bigger deal to compare Persona to SMT rather than, say, Final Fantasy XIV to WoW, is that Persona and SMT are enmeshed. They're titles from the same publisher, with a lot of the same team members, with their origins entangled. And so when people identify with a group so heavily, they want to be seen for what they are. They want others to see the difference, how we see green versus blue. So while it is unfair to compare the two games when they have different goals, the real downfall of these reviewers is that they fail to see how passionate and divided a vocal part of this community is. Us humans have a tendency to define ourselves by groups, to define our identities. Even if you don't have the element of competition, we see ourselves as part of a bigger group, whether that's your country, your school, or even your hobby. That isn't necessarily a problem either. To a certain extent, it's okay to identify as part of a group you surround yourself with. It's in your evolutionary best interest. A single human out in the wild is far less likely to survive than a group of people. And if there's a common interest that can tie that group of people together, then that increases the chances of that group staying together and increases the chance of you surviving. Where it becomes a problem is when you look at us versus them, which is a common social identity theory. In 1979, Tajfel and Turner posited that there are three mental processes involved in evaluating others as an us or them, otherwise known as an in-group or an out-group. The first process is social categorization, where we make social categories in order to understand our social environment, perhaps by religion or where people work or where you tend to see them. The second process is social identification, where we adopt the identity of the group we categorized ourselves in. The third process is social comparison, in which we compare the group we identify as to the other group. In order for our self-esteem to be maintained, we need to see our group favorably in comparison to the other. This is obvious in things like racism and classism, but it also exists on a smaller level. Before Blizzard's scandal, it was easy for the WoW community to pick out what they didn't like about 14 and make it the loud narrative. You want your game to be the best because you spent a lot of time in this social group. If there is something wrong with it, then what does that say about you? That isn't to say any criticism levied against 14 is incorrect, but more so that those negatives were used as a way to elevate the status of WoW's social group, a method some use to elevate their own self-esteem. And when the information about Blizzard came out, it created a bit of an identity crisis. Many identified themselves with WoW, but if WoW is associated with such egregious behavior, what did that say about them? And so a lot of distancing was based on self-preservation. In the same way, this is why reviews that compare SMT to Persona hit such a nerve. Yes, it sucks because we want people to give SMT a shot and not constantly compare it to Persona, but because we also identify heavily with these groups, it can't help but feel kind of personal. It's not inherently a bad thing to define part of your identity based on a group, but it's important we take a step back and become self-aware of what's happening. I'm definitely not trying to make the argument that we shouldn't be frustrated with reviewers who are reviewing a game based on expectations and algorithm rather than its own merits. And I'm not saying that every WoW player would love 14 if they gave it a chance. But we need to be aware when we're comparing things. We're never going to stop comparing similar things as it's integral to how we see the world. However, without self-awareness, we may end up saying things like SMT is Persona without the heart. Thanks for watching, and if you want to like, give it a like. If you want to comment, let me know how I'm wrong about everything. You can, it's down there, and if you want to subscribe, you can subscribe, and sometimes I put videos out, and sometimes I don't, but I hope that you do, because I like hanging out with you guys. Alright, and I hope you have a great day, and I hope you enjoy SMT5. Enjoy SMT5.